Good morning. My name is Kent Burdett, and this is It's Time for a Rethink. My message this morning is staying within the big story, and the text this morning is John 14, 1 through to 14. John 14 is a text commonly used at funerals that is intended to provide comfort to those who are grieving with the promise of life after death in heaven. Now, without wishing to take away from this usage, I want to say this morning that this text is offering more than the promise of life after death. For life after death is not the end of the story. It's part of the story, but it's not the main part. And that's something that may be difficult for people to hear because of the way we've been brought up and trained to understand the gospel. The mission of God, the main purpose of God, the big story in the scriptures, is God's intent to restore the whole creation, in fact, to create a new heavens and a new earth. And this text is a declaration that even the departure of Jesus from the disciples did not mark the end of God's work in the world, nor was it the end of God's work in the disciples and through them into the world. Now, the disciples thought that the death of Jesus was the end of his presence with them and the end of his work in the world, but it wasn't. In the same way, his departure or his leaving them, they will be inclined to think that his departure from them, his ascending into heaven, means the end of his presence with them and the end of his work in the world. But again, no, it won't be. Change for the disciples indeed is happening. And grief and confusion will soon be something that they're dealing with. In order to keep the disciples on track, in order to keep them from going forward, in order to keep them involved in the work which he has given them to do, Jesus promises them that after a time of separation, they will be with him in heaven. And the promise is that not even death will keep the promises of God from being fulfilled in them and through them. The further promise of God is that God will continue to work in the disciples and through them after Jesus has departed from them. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. Jesus summed up his life's mission and gave the disciples a new command to operate by: love one another. And what the text is saying is this must continue even after Jesus has gone. Even after Jesus has departed into heaven, the disciples must keep to the task at hand. They must keep focused on what the true mission of God really is. And so Jesus, as he prepares to leave the disciples, he comforts them with these words: "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." What we need to understand is that these words were words of comfort that Jesus gave to his disciples. They were not a declaration of their mission. It was a promise that not even death itself could separate them from his presence. Again, as he prepares to leave the disciples, he knows that the transition will be difficult for them. And so he gives them these words to encourage them so that they will not become so overwhelmed by their circumstances that they stop doing the work that he has given them to do. And this work is the work of going into all the world, transforming the world in the presence and power of God's love. This must continue. And so Jesus says to them, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me." Again, these words have the intent of saying, do not stop doing what I have told you to do. Have confidence in God, have confidence in me. Keep working even though I am not with you. And again, no matter what you go through, Jesus is saying, remember, evil will not prevail. God is the rightful king in all the earth, and one day he will rule over the whole of the creations, over the creation. And the disciples again are given the promise that when they have completed their life work, they will be with Jesus in heaven, and the work of God will go on. However, life in heaven for the disciples will not be the end of their journey, the completion of God's plan. If, as we have been taught, all life ends with going to heaven after you die, it would not mean that the mission of God had been completed. In fact, it would have meant that the mission of God had not been completed, and that sin and death and evil had in fact prevailed in the world. What we need to grasp is that nothing short of the complete restoration of the whole of the creation will mark the fulfillment of the mission of God in the world, set in motion in Jesus and carried on in through his disciples. Again, the disciples, in the midst of all that was happening, needed to be comforted and given hope in the present in order to assist them to stay to the task at hand. But again, the hope of heaven is not a replacement for the mission of God which they have received from Jesus. Jesus said, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also." The New Testament word for dwelling places is monē, which means a temporary dwelling, like a roadside inn. And so Jesus gives them the promise of life in heaven after death. But this, again, is not a statement of where everything is going to, but it's a statement of where they will be after they've completed their life's work. They will be with Jesus in heaven, and the work of God will continue on in the world. There is in the scriptures the promise of the resurrection, a whole new embodied existence in the new creation, and this is what all of life is moving towards. Not life in heaven after death, but to participate in the resurrection at the end of the age. Oops. Having faith and believing in God and in Jesus will not mean for the disciples simply holding on until they arrive in heaven. There is critical work for them to be doing. The world needs to be liberated. It needs to be set free from the powers. It needs to be transformed and renewed by the love of God. And this is the task to which the church, the disciples, are given. And Jesus said, "I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it." This is not a name it and claim it theology, as some have inclined to say. This is rather Jesus saying to his disciples, I will be with you, I will be in you, and as you do my work, whatever you ask me to do, I will do it in order to make sure that my work is completed in you and through you. Again, the mission of God, to restate it again, is to remake the whole world through the disciples of Jesus, who will follow in his way by laying down their lives for the world, by loving one another. But to do this, they must need to keep faith, they must have hope, and they must not stop working even though Jesus is about to leave them. So the mission of God is to remake the creation by overcoming the powers of sin, death, and evil in the world. And it's God's intention to return the creation to God's original arrangement of having human beings made in the image of God govern the world in love in God's way. And this is the mission to which the disciples have been given. What has been put in motion in Jesus will come to fulfillment. Nothing will stop it, not even death itself. So the disciples are told to keep working even when evil and sin and death appear to be strong. Don't despair. Don't give up. Don't opt for going to heaven as an escape from this world. Nothing short of the complete and total restoration of the creation will be sufficient. And so as the disciples are trying to make sense of everything that's happening, they gain a sense that Jesus is saying to them, keep working, for nothing will separate us from God's love in Jesus, not even death itself. So God bless. Keep up the good work. Keep the faith, which means don't stop working to transform the world and to make it into what God wants it to be, a world based on God's love. God bless. Amen.